As we continue our study of comparative anatomy at slide 46, we want to remind ourselves that our analogous structures are due to what we call convergent evolution and not because of a common ancestor. Convergent evolution says if you are living where there are similar environmental pressures and you have natural selection, then similar, or a synonym for that, analogous structures will develop in distantly related organisms. In slide 47, we begin our discussion of embryology. And this states, and this is just an example of this, if you look at the early development of all vertebrate embryos, that's those with a backbone, it resembles one another in an uncanny way. Notice that in each of these organisms, they possess and are expressing the genes for gill slits and tails, and this indicates a common ancestor. Another thing that is very interesting is how much all organisms share basic biochemical processes. For example, all organisms use DNA for the genetic blueprint. All organisms use RNA, ribosomes, and the same genetic code for translation. All organisms use basically the same 20 amino acids for their proteins. And all organisms use ATP to transfer their energy. We feel that genetic similarities imply evolutionary relatedness. In other words, the more closely related you are, the more similar your DNA and other biochemicals will be. If you'll notice in slide 52, you have a comparison of the DNA nucleotide sequence of cytochrome C gene between human and mouse, and I think you'll find that fascinating. Natural selection is what Darwin and Wallace believed modified populations over time. They called this descent with modification, which means each generation has very slight differences that accumulate to create major transformations in populations. Now let's talk about that process of evolution. The first thing that they said, members of a population are different from one another. And this is due primarily to random mutations in DNA. And don't forget, mutations can be a positive thing, they can be a negative thing, or they might be what we call neutral and have no real effect. At least some of the differences in the individuals in the population are due to characteristics that can be passed from parent to offspring. In other words, they can be inherited. In each generation, some individuals survive long enough to reproduce and some don't. Many, many more organisms are born than actually can survive. And so some of them are going to have more offspring that actually do live. Individuals with advantageous traits, that is, those characteristics that make them most suited to the environment, survive the longest and leave the most offspring. And this is the process that Darwin and Wallace called natural selection. And one of the things I want you to remember, is that natural selection acts on individuals within populations, but it is the population's characteristics that change gradually over time. We're going to be talking about lots of different kinds of evidence for evolution, and the first one is what we call controlled breeding. And in that, we use this process called artificial selection, where It's called selective breeding, where humans produce plants and animals by selecting the traits that we desire, that we value. And for example, in just a few thousand years, we were able to domesticate the wolf and create what we call a dog. And now look at all the characteristics that we have selected for in dogs. Examples of natural selection today include things like antibiotic resistance in bacteria. For example, if you are sick and you treat a group of people with an antibiotic to get rid of their bacteria, it will only kill a certain percentage of that bacteria. And over time, that bacterium can develop resistance to the antibiotic. We have many bacteria that are resistant to penicillin. I'm sure you have heard of MRSA and VRSA. Also, if you will notice in the slides to come, there's a discussion of changing coloration in Trinidad guppies, a discussion of pesticide resistance, and then a discussion of where Anolis sagriae lizards were introduced to various islands. So please take the time to look over those. Remember, natural selection works on phenotypes. There are variations on which things work, and these are produced by spontaneous mutations. So the variation is because of mutation in the DNA. But remember, natural selection tries to select or choose those organisms that are best adapted because of the traits that they possess to a particular environment.